Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We have a very special series of programs planned for you over the next couple of months. Today being the fourth stop on the Historic Artist Homes and Studios virtual road trip. The virtual road trip is a collaboration between the James Castle House, which is located in Boise, Idaho, the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, which is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and 5 other participating artist sites, such as the Melrose Plantation, where self-taught African-American artist Clementine Hunter lived and worked for most of her life. My name is Rachel Reichert, and I'm your guide on this virtual road trip. I also oversee the Castle House in Boise, and with me today is Valerie Balint, the program manager of the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program. Hello, Valerie.
Hi, Rachel.
And we also have with us Heather Tischner, who is the director of the Melrose Plantation and who will be your guide today. Hello, Heather.
Hi, Rachel. Hi, Valerie. It's pleasant to be here today.
We also have Lavona Andrews offering live ASL interpretation during today's event. Hello, Lavona. We are excited to bring you into the homes and studios, even if it is virtually, to learn more about 6 remarkable artists and the spaces that supported their art-making practices. As you may know, today's tour is a part of a series of tours, each exploring a different artist home and studio, offered monthly through August. If you haven't signed up for the upcoming tours, we'll add a link in the chat where you can learn more. For those of you just learning about the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, also commonly referred to as HAHS, this is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is currently a coalition of 48 museums that were previously homes and working studios of many amazing artists. Through their support and advocacy, HAHS is helping to preserve the nation's legacy of creativity in the visual arts. This program aims to connect meaningful visitor experiences at authentic creative places. The really great thing about HAHS is all of the sites that it supports are actually open to the public. And I hope that we can all escape our devices and actually go visit these incredible museums in person, many of which are open now. I also highly recommend checking out HAHS online to learn more about the sites that we explore through the virtual road trip and other sites they support. You can learn more at artisthomes.org. They also have a mailing list offering a monthly newsletter with lots of great information and have various social platforms you can engage with them. We will add links to the chat now so you can learn more about that. Before we get started, I just want to address a few housekeeping items. We will have an opportunity to answer some of your questions at the end of today's tour. So throughout the tour today, please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A box. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. You can also find previous stops along the virtual road trip both at the James Castle House YouTube channel and the forthcoming Historic Artist Homes and Studios YouTube channel. Because this is a virtual road trip, I want to help set the stage a bit. Last month, we visited Denver, Colorado's Kirkland Museum of Fine and Decorative Art. Today, virtually, we are traveling from Denver to Natchitoches, Louisiana, which is approximately a 16-hour drive. So before we leave Colorado, we'll pass through the Pike and San Isabel National Forest, then on through the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, where you will actually see 750 feet tall dunes rising out of the base of the Sangre de Cristo mountain range. Something I'm looking forward to actually seeing in real life. From there, we'll pass through the right corner of New Mexico, briefly stopping in Santa Fe for a nice lunch and driving into Texas. We'll drive through Amarillo and check out the 6th Street Historic District before moving into the Lake Meredith area within the Canadian River Valley. We'll drive through the Lyndon B. Johnson National Grassland before driving again through the DFW Metroplex, which, fun fact, it's the 9th most populated city in the United States. From there, we'll take about 4 hours to get into Natchitoches, which is the oldest settlement in the Louisiana Purchase. A 20-minute drive will land us at the Melrose Plantation, again, a site celebrating African-American artist Clementine Hunter. Before we move on to Heather's incredible tour today, I've asked Valerie to help set the stage just a bit more on Natchitoches and Clementine Hunter.
Thank you, Rachel, to you and everyone involved at the James Castle House for spearheading the virtual road trip in collaboration with Historic Artists' Homes and Studios. I'm excited to have us highlight the extraordinary life and art of Clementine Hunter this afternoon, allowing many of us to get a first glimpse, but hopefully not the last glimpse, at the moving, inspiring work she created at Melrose Plantation. While I have known Hunter's work for some time, I must confess that my very initial introduction was through reading Oprah Winfrey, who is a collector and superfan. I have actually not yet had the pleasure of visiting this site in person. It is one of very few sites in the HAHS network that I have not traveled to personally, but I look forward to setting down on the terra firma of Hunter's career in the not too distant future. So in anticipation of that excursion, I have compiled some must-sees for my own trip, which I will share with you briefly today. As an unabashed, frequent pilgrim to New Orleans, I know well the fantastic architecture, food, music, and gracious Southern hospitality that Louisiana has to offer. And Natchitoches has its own treasures in all of these areas. The main street, which you see in town, is a picture postcard of historic architecture, enticing small shops, and great food. If so inclined, and I certainly am, you can take a horse and carriage tour through the historic district. But this town boasts an 18th century history that is compelling as well. In 1714, French-Canadian entrepreneur Louis-Antoine Jacquereau du Saint-Denis pushed into the wilderness of present-day central Louisiana, establishing a trading post along the Red River on land occupied by the native Natchitoches people. It was the first permanent European settlement in what would become the Louisiana Territory, and at a crossroads where French, Spanish, African, Native American, and Creole influences combined, and all of which are still vibrantly present today. Saint-Denis established a fort and trading post, which you see at right, which is now a historic site. By 1830, that fort was in ruins. So this is a replica based on the original blueprints of 1716, which is crazy to me. This is a wonderful place to learn about the early history of Natchitoches and how the indigenous tribes of the Three Caddo Confederacy played out a vital role in establishing trade and communication links among the French, the Spanish, and the native people of the region. One of the things I discovered about Natchitoches is that it has a rich layering of history through its fantastic architecture. The Prud'homme Roquier House is one wonderful example, constructed between 1790 and 1811. This home predates most other surviving buildings downtown, although it was later remodeled, as you see here, to resemble the Federal and Greek Revival style. It was originally a French Creole building. This is a signature example of builders using the traditional method of erecting the structure with cypress beams and then filling in the void spaces with a mixture of mud, Spanish moss, and deer hair. There is also a lot of magnificent ecclesiastical architecture. Here is the minor Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, given that prestigious designation by the Pope in 2009. And this is a wonderful example of mid-19th century architecture in town. All the original artistic fittings and furnishings were actually imported from France, and the stunning stained glass windows that you see at left were executed in this country. This building was restored to its full glory in 1996. But no visit to this town is complete without a stop at the oldest general store in Louisiana. Cafe Frederick was established in 1863 and has been doing business out of its downtown location since 1893. Today, shoppers will discover an eclectic selection of goods from general hardware and vintage toys to Christmas decorations and even coffins. Every sale is run up on the store's first hand-cranked cash register that has been in use since 1917. And that's legit because Heather is shaking her head. Who knows what treasures await you here? And next door, you can satisfy your sweet tooth at the Cane River Candy Company, indulging in some of their nostalgic candy or selecting other delights such as gummy bears, handmade chocolates, or praline roasted pecans, a nut synonymous with the South. Of course, this area on the banks of the Cane River Lake offers outdoor enticements as well. You can take a riverboat ride on this meandering water body, which was once part of the Greater Red River, or visit the expansive grounds of several former plantations that are now historic parks, which you see at right. Like you should just let the warm breeze, the dense, damp air, and the rich, loamy scents of lush vegetation and magnolia sweep you away with amazing sensory sights and smells that you can really only truly experience in this region of our country. But perhaps Natchitoches is most famous as the filming site of the 1989 blockbuster Steel Magnolias, where the town asserted itself as a character on par with the 6 powerhouse actresses who starred in the movie. Today, you can actually stay in the impressive house that served as the home of the central character, Julia Roberts, visit the church where she got married with blush and bashful bunting all over that church, the site of the famous Easter egg hunt in that movie, and even the home beauty shop where Dolly Parton served as the hub for these interconnected women. Theme tours abound. All you have to do is look them up on the internet. And as someone who came of age in the 80s, this will be a must-see for me. But for devotees of the film, you are familiar with the Christmas Light Festival, which I am happy to say was not a movie convention, but an actual annual event in this town. If you're looking to travel at another time of year, other festival opportunities await you, including the Summer Zydeco and Poker Run Bash, the early fall Meat Pie Festival, which just sounds yummy, and the late fall annual Caddo Nation Powwow. But of course, my visit and yours will culminate with an introduction to Clementine Hunter. This self-taught artist who inspired an opera and whose work is now getting the national and international recognition it deserves. If you travel within the next year, let your itinerary take you to New Orleans, where you can take in a wonderful exhibition of her works organized by the Louisiana State Museum and on view at Cabildo, a venue in the city's French Quarter. If you're not quite ready to travel yet, then go to the archives at Southwestern Louisiana State University, where you can listen to actual taped interviews with Clementine Hunter. Here she was given an honorary degree decades after she was denied entrance to her own exhibition due to segregation laws, or enjoy an excerpt of the opera Robert Wilson wrote about Hunter, her work, and her life at Melrose, and perhaps order the publication of this recently discovered sketchbook, generously shared by the private collector who purchased it, and now available through New Orleans University Press. And we will put all these links in the chat. But in truth, there is nothing like physically immersing yourself in Hunter's daily world at Melrose. This multi-talented, self-taught woman who did not even begin creating art until midlife and when she was a grandmother is a reminder to us all that it is never, ever too late to start to be creative. The epic mural cycle she painted on site of her life on that plantation is a story only she could tell, a shining example of truly insider art, as opposed to perhaps the more familiar term of outsider art. The food historian geek in me goes gaga for the cookbook she co-authored, and I cannot wait to replicate the recipe you see on screen. Her story is incredibly inspiring, but it reminds us that there is much work to do to better tell the stories of underrepresented artists, included women and people of color. But before we start our journey with our amazing host, Heather, today, I want to draw your final attention to one of the wonderful and unexpected connections that can exist between HAHS sites. This Zinnia work by Hunter at Lower Center was acquired just this past year by the Brandywine Museum in Chaddsford, Pennsylvania, that owns and operates both the N.C. Wyeth Home and Studio and the Andrew Wyeth Studio, making this another HAHS destination to add to your growing list. I look forward to the journey Heather is going to take us on this afternoon. My thanks to her, and of course to you, Rachel, as we embark.
Wow, Valerie, I want to go on a road trip with you. So without further ado, Heather, we are very excited to visit the Melrose Plantation with you today.
Well, thank you both very much for that lovely introduction, and Valerie, that amazing introduction to Natchitoches and the area. I'm definitely looking forward to welcoming you down here and showing you around, even though I myself am a fairly recent transplant. I know that Natchitoches has a ton of attractions, and you mentioned several festivals, and this is definitely a city of festivals. And as the city and the state and our country start to reopen, a lot of those festivals are coming back up. There's always going to be something to see down here. So thank you very much for those introductions. And as Rachel mentioned, my name is Heather Tischner, and I am the director of Melrose Plantation. Melrose Plantation is a National Historic Site owned and operated by the Association for the Preservation of Historic Natchitoches in Natchitoches, Louisiana. The APHN's mission is to promote and preserve an understanding of the rich cultural heritage of Natchitoches and the Cane River area. We have a diverse cultural landscape in this region, and our site embodies several aspects of that diverse history, including the often intersecting stories of women, free people of color, and artists of the 20th century. There is still work to be done to tell the whole story of all the people who lived and worked at our site, especially the hundreds of enslaved people whose history here largely remains untold. Today, Melrose is a historic site with 9 buildings spread over 5.5 acres. We are open to the public 5 days a week, the whole year. We offer guided tours of specific buildings, which includes the African House murals of Clementine Hunter, and self-guided tours are also available for those who simply wish to stroll the grounds and see the buildings. We also run an annual Arts and Crafts Festival in the spring and other programs centered on local history throughout the year. Now, it would be very short-sighted of us to think that the history of the site we're visiting tonight starts at the moment the artist arrived. Before we begin talking about Clementine Hunter and her work, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Natchitoches tribe and the Caddo Federation, whose land the site sits on today. Clementine Hunter is an African-American folk artist whose work prominently portrays the African-American experience of the rural South in the first half of the 20th century, of which she was a direct participant. She was born in 1887 and died in 1988 at age 101, having lived through the sharecropping and agrarian years of the early 20th century, through the increasing mechanization and industrialization of farming, which largely ended the plantation system in the 1960s and 70s. This weekend is Juneteenth, a holiday that commemorates the 1865 announcement of emancipation in neighboring Galveston, Texas. Clementine's grandmother had been enslaved, and Clementine grew up in a community that had known the horrors of slavery intimately. Even after slavery was ended, most rural African Americans were bound to poverty through the sharecropping system of the South. Clementine's family were sharecroppers. She herself was a field worker and then a domestic worker at a plantation, and she knew well the daily and seasonal rhythms of Southern farm life. Her art focused on the everyday activities and rituals of the Southern rural African American community of which she was a part. The amazing thing, as Valerie mentioned, is that she didn't start painting until she was in her 50s. But since she lived to be 101, she had a half century to share her visions with the world. Today, I'm going to share the story of Clementine Hunter, how she began to paint, what kinds of art she created, and especially focus on the African House murals of Melrose, of which we here are the grateful custodians. Clementine Hunter was born as Clemence Rubin in either late 1886 or early 1887. She was born in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, at Hidden Hill Plantation, now known as Little Eva Plantation, which some say was the real-life inspiration for the classic novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Clemence was a Creole with African, French, Irish, and Indigenous ancestors. She spoke French until her second husband taught her English when she was already in her 30s. Her grandmother had been enslaved. Her mother and father were sharecroppers at Hidden Hill. Clemence's father, looking for better working conditions, moved the family to nearby Melrose Plantation when Clemence was a young teenager. It was sometime after this move that the girl began calling herself Clementine instead of Clemence. Natchitoches is the oldest French settlement in the Louisiana Purchase, founded in 1714 as a small fort on the border between French and Spanish territories in North America. As the town grew, plantations spread out along the Red River and smaller rivers. Many of the plantations founded south of Natchitoches along the Cane River were founded by free Creoles of color. These are people who were offspring of white, French, and Spanish settlers and soldiers, indigenous locals, and enslaved or freed African and Franco-African peoples. By the early 19th century, some of the free Creoles of color had formed their own community, Isle Brevel, south of Natchitoches. Melrose Plantation was founded by a member of the Isle Brevel community named Louis Matoire. Louis's mother was an enslaved woman named Marie-Thérèse Quan, and Louis's father was a white French settler named Claude Thomas Pierre Matoire. Louis, his mother, and his siblings were born as enslaved people, but were all granted their freedom by their father and partner, Pierre Matoire. Louis had 9 siblings, most of whom settled in the same area, and the Matoire clan eventually became the largest property owners in the American Southeast among all free peoples of color. So Melrose Plantation has a unique foundation as a plantation owned and operated by free people of color who also owned enslaved peoples. We tell the story of Louis Matoire and his family at Melrose, especially as Matoire descendants are still very active in the Cane River region today, and indeed, some even work at our site. The plantation was sold by Louis Matoire's grandson and passed through a few owners. It continued to operate as a cotton plantation throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. Cammie Henry eventually owned it starting in 1899, and while continuing to farm cotton and pecans, she began offering Melrose as a rural retreat for writers, artists, and photographers that she knew. In the 1920s and 1930s, she invited friends and friends of friends to come and stay at Melrose. They were offered room and board for free, staying in one of her outbuildings, coming to the big house for dinner, and could escape the pressures of daily life and be inspired by the rustic setting. There was a catch though. Cammie expected any artist or writer who accepted her offer to be productive while they were here. They needed to be writing or painting or taking photos and not just loafing around. Many artists of the Southern Renaissance made their way to Melrose during this time, including Lyle Saxon, Rourke Bradford, Ada Jack Carver, Caroline Dorman, Alberta Kinsey, and Dorothy Coleman. There is a rumor that William Faulkner visited, but we have not been able to verify that. This artist retreat was important for 2 reasons. One, many of the artists that Cammie invited were indeed very productive during their stays here and enjoyed successful careers. The second reason was that one of Cammie's employees at this time, throughout the entire artist retreat era, was a domestic worker named Clementine Hunter. And Clementine Hunter has become the most famous artist associated with Melrose Plantation. Clementine did not become an artist until she was in her mid-50s. She had only attended school for a year or so when she was younger, never learning to read or write. She chose to work instead to help support her family. When she moved to Melrose at the age of 13 or 14, she began working in the fields with her parents, picking cotton and pecans. She got married and had children. She raised her family in a small cabin on the plantation grounds. In the 1920s, she began working in the big house, doing domestic labor instead of field labor, doing laundry, watching the Henry children, cleaning, and cooking. She must have seen the visiting artists painting at Melrose during these years, but the nature of her work and her subordinate position did not allow her to sit and watch them or learn from them. The oft-repeated story of how Clementine began painting goes like this. One day in 1938 or 39, Clementine was cleaning up after Alberta Kinsey, one of the artists who frequently visited Melrose, had left. She picked up some discarded tubes of oil paint and asked someone if she could take them home with her. She was given permission, and one story says that she was also given an old window shade to serve as a canvas. She took these things home and that night painted her very first picture. And she was hooked. She started painting every night after her long day's work was done. She sat down in her kitchen and painted by lamplight, carving out a time to do work for herself and her own enjoyment. Clementine has been called variously a primitive artist, memory artist, and folk artist. She claimed that she painted what she saw in her mind's eye, from memories of people and events that she experienced and stories she knew. She did not like painting using models or photographs. She was a self-taught painter who developed her own style. The chief characteristics of her art are bright, often primary colors, large brushstrokes, her own sense of perspective organized along horizontal lines, and a strong sense of story. She painted with oil paints. Some of her early works have oil paints that have been so thinned with turpentine, they look more like watercolors. Whether this is because she was experimenting with techniques or simply trying to get as much use as possible from her supplies, I can't say. She often applied paint more thickly to areas where she wanted to convey texture, such as the petals on zinnias, a mound of picked cotton, or a washpot full of linens. As she got older, her eyesight got worse and worse, and she was also affected by arthritis, especially in her hands, the legacy of a lifetime of physical labor. This resulted in her brushstrokes getting even larger, and the paint was often applied quite thickly. Her work can be sorted into 4 categories: work, play, religion, and other. Examples of work include cotton planting, hoeing, and picking, pecan harvesting, as you see on the right, and wash day scenes on the left. Play includes playing cards, eating watermelon, and Saturday night at the honky tonk. Religion includes baptisms, church services, weddings, the crucifixion, and angels. Other includes flowers, portraits, and a brief experiment with abstracts. It is estimated that Clementine painted over 5,000 paintings. The majority of them were done on canvas, but she would paint on anything: plywood, snuff bottles, irons, furniture, cardboard, and more. She could not afford to buy her own art supplies. Her work at Melrose did not afford her that luxury. There were several major supporters of her work who kept her supplied with paints, brushes, and canvases. She repaid them with finished artwork and also sold paintings to people who visited her house. She started off selling paintings for 25 cents, then 50 cents, then $1, and then several dollars. We still get visitors to Melrose today who tell us that they or their parents visited Clementine in her little house and purchased a painting for a few dollars, a painting that still hangs in their home. Clementine never got rich by painting. At best, she was able to make her life and her family's lives a little more comfortable. She always claimed that she felt driven to paint. She had images in her head and had to get them out. So she painted practically every night, and once she retired, during the day. While Clementine was working at Melrose Plantation, she met one of the writers who was staying there. His name was Francois Mignon, a writer from New York State who claimed he was French. Francois came to Melrose for a visit and then ended up staying for over 30 years. Cammie Henry enlisted him to help manage her library, and after she died, he stayed at Melrose as the curator of the historical items and buildings she had gathered. Francois was an excellent promoter of Melrose. He had an eye for what made a good story and worked to promote Melrose as a tourist attraction by writing newspaper columns, magazine articles, and organizing site visits. Francois became Clementine's first big supporter. He claimed he was one of the first to see her paintings and recognized her potential right away. Francois kept a daily journal of his life at Melrose and wrote articles and books about the history of the site and his time there. The tricky thing about him is that he never lets the facts get in the way of a good story. Or as someone described him, he was a poet first and a historian second. Nevertheless, he was a great friend to Clementine and worked to promote her art to his friends and anybody he thought could help. His goal was to get greater recognition of her work and enable her to continue painting. It was Francois who came up with the idea for what is considered one of Clementine's greatest works. He was thinking of ways to promote Melrose and her. There is a building on site, African House, that is one of the original buildings on the plantation. It is now thought to have been built in the early 1800s, but in Francois's time, the story was that it had been built in the 1750s or so by Marie-Thérèse Kwankwán, African matriarch of the Matoyer clan. Before Francois, the building was called Casa Verde, or the Mushroom House, but Francois was so taken with the distinct look of it, he felt sure it was built by the Franco-African Kwankwán and her enslaved workers in the African style of their homeland. So he felt it should be called African House, and he was so persuasive that it's now its name. While the building was indeed constructed by enslaved workers of the Matoyers, most architects nowadays say it is designed in a French style, even if it is rather unique to the region. It has 2-foot thick brick walls on the ground floor, wooden bars on the windows, and it had no interior staircase to the second floor until one was added in the 1930s. The highly distinctive roof ensures that sunlight and rain never touches the walls of the building. It was probably built as a barn and or a storehouse, and certainly was still used as such into the 20th century. In the 1950s, as it was being cleaned up, Francois decided that it would be a wonderful idea for Clementine Hunter to paint a large mural series inside the building, an African-American artist decorating an African-built structure. Before we look in more detail at the African House murals, I want to show you a 3D rendering of the building. This video was done by the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, which we are very lucky to have based in Natchitoches near us. The video gives a good sense of the size of the building and its layout. Notice that the Clementine Hunter murals are upstairs on the second floor. The video is a little jerky, but we are showing now the interior of the building after doing a walk around the exterior. That is the staircase to the second floor that was installed in the 1930s. And I believe we're going to go up the stairs now. And this is the second floor where the African House murals are. Don't worry, we will get closer looks at these paintings very soon. Now we are heading back outside. As you can see, it's a very simple structure. And there we go, that is the video. All right, as you saw on the video, the building is only one room on the ground floor and one room on the second floor. When Francois asked Clementine to paint the African House murals, she had never painted a large-scale painting before, and now he was asking her to do a whole series. She accepted without hesitation. There are 9 panels in total, which entirely wrap around the upstairs room. They worked together to plot out the topics for each panel. Francois claimed he left the interpretation of each topic to her, but specifically requested the circular design for the space between 2 windows, as he felt it was a good start and end point for the whole series. The entire work tells a story of African-American plantation experiences in the early 20th century. Oh, it looks like we've lost our slides. The panels are remarkably well-rounded in showing a wide variety of activity, locations, and personalities while being completely grounded in a particular space and time. There are 2 panels devoted to cotton, 2 to birth and death, 2 to work and play, and 2 to Melrose specifically. The final panel is the Tondo, which offers an overview of the Cane River area. With this series, Clementine Hunter, despite being illiterate, left behind a permanent record of the lives of the African Americans who lived here. The murals are so large, so colorful, and so full of detail that they are impossible to ignore. Each panel is painted on plywood, which measures 8 feet long by 4 feet high. Clementine worked on 1 panel at a time from her house. When it was finished, Francois sent some of the plantation workers to pick it up and bring it to African House, where the panels were installed on the 2nd floor. I think maybe we're going a bit fast on the slides. She began painting the first panel on June 8, 1955, and finished the last one on July 21st, only 7 weeks later. The African House murals showcase many of the themes and ideas that Clementine had already established in her art and would revisit again and again. This makes them an ideal work to examine. Let's look at some of these panels more closely. The cotton panels you see here are in the northwest corner. These 2 panels show details of the cotton growing and harvesting process. Clementine picked cotton herself when she was a teenager and often claimed it was her favorite type of work to do. Women picking cotton became one of the signature themes of her art, and she painted countless variations of this scene throughout her career. On these 2 panels, you can also find evidence of her unique approach to art, self-taught methods of depiction that occur regularly in her work. On both panels, the cotton fields and workers are stacked horizontally on top of each other to suggest perspective. At the ends of each field, there is a water boy giving water to one of the workers. As Clementine knew intimately, the water boy was a very important figure for the field hands. To signal his importance, she's painted him as larger than the field worker. There is another example of her making someone larger than life on this same panel. In the corner, there is a wedding occurring. Notice how the bride is much larger than anyone else. For who is the most important person at a wedding? The bridesmaid also looms large, then the groom, and finally the preacher is much smaller than everyone else. Clementine often painted the preacher as a smaller figure in her works, clearly demonstrating her feelings about the clergy. Speaking of clergy, the next 2 panels, as we go counterclockwise around the room, are about religion. One corner is a baptism and the other is a funeral. Clementine was baptized and eventually buried as a Catholic, but spent many of her Sundays at the local Baptist church. She said it was livelier. Her religious paintings often mixed Catholic and Protestant imagery. In the baptism scene, we have Catholic priests leading the baptismal candidates to the Cane River, where they are receiving a Baptist full immersion baptism. Many of Clementine's paintings include stories and people from her life. This panel has one of my favorite stories. See this woman on the riverbank? Her name was Dorsey. She wasn't happy that everyone's attention was on the girls being baptized in the river. So she pretended to be seized by the Holy Spirit and jumped into the river too. This got everyone looking at her, especially when someone yelled at her to watch out, for the water moccasin was in there with her. Clementine commented, right then and there, Dorsey done lost her religion and crawled slap out on the bank. The next 2 panels are domestic scenes. Clementine frequently compressed time in her works and depicted multiple events happening at the same time that would have played out in a more linear fashion in real life. A good example is the Saturday night events happening at the local bar in the top left of this mural. Center left. A fight is happening where 2 men are arguing, bullets are fired, and someone is hit, all taking place in the same room at the same time. The other panel shows wash day, and Clementine arranges the women, who are all working at different parts of the laundry process, to make good use of the space. She was very well acquainted with all the hard work that went into doing laundry before electric washing machines came along. Not only did she do her own, she also did the washing for the Henry family of Melrose and several other white Cane River families. Interestingly, instead of depicting herself as one of the washerwomen, she has chosen to paint herself as the artist in this scene, sitting on a chair and painting. One thing to note about this self-portrait, Clementine was famously very petite, and you'll notice that when she is sitting on this chair, her feet do not touch the ground. She also balances the canvas on her lap instead of using an easel, which apparently she preferred to do because an easel was too far away to paint comfortably. These two panels are about the Melrose Plantation site. We can see several of the buildings here, the big house to the right, African house in the middle, and Yucca house to the left on the next panel. There are people working and moving across the space, giving us a sense of how busy a working plantation was and how much work and how many people were involved in keeping everything going. There are workers going out to the fields, gardeners, domestic staff, Henry family members, and several guests of the artist colony. Here is Alberta Kinsey, in the bottom left, the painter who inadvertently supplied Clementine with her first paints. And here are the writers who stayed in Yucca House the most. Francois Mignon, holding a souvenir plate of Melrose on the left, and on the right, Lyle Saxon, holding a newspaper, as he was also a journalist from New Orleans. In this section, Clementine has again included herself, but in her daytime role as a domestic worker. She is serving coffee to Francois and Lyle, as she commonly did in the 1920s and 30s. We still see her sense of perspective, as these plants growing around the roof of African House show. They are meant to be the gardens behind the house. She has also included nods to the history of this site by painting Marie-Thérèse Quanquan and Pierre Metoyer in front of African House. If you recall, they are the founders of the Metoyer family of Cane River, and during Clementine's time, it was believed that Quanquan built the first buildings at Melrose instead of her son Louis, who did. So again, we see her signaling Quanquan's importance. Look at how big she is compared to Pierre Metoyer and compared to the workers. The final panel is the smallest. This is the one that Francois specifically suggested. He had a souvenir plate of Melrose and gave it to Clementine, asking her to copy it for this panel. She didn't often like to copy other images, but when she did, she always put her unique stamp on it. You can see that she faithfully copied the general outline of the map. It's a bird's eye view of the area around Melrose. There's the Cane River curving through and Melrose buildings in the bend of the river. Other historic buildings dot the landscape. Clementine couldn't resist adding her signature cotton workers to the fields. These murals became Clementine's most famous works, but as I mentioned, she painted thousands more images. After completing the African House murals, Francois also had her paint murals in Yucca House, one of which is seen here, and Ghana House on site. But these were taken down and sold when the site and all of its furnishings were sold in 1970. Only the African House murals stayed where they were first installed. She was industrious and had many talents. She was also an accomplished quilter and sewer. We have one of her quilts on display, which is said to have been a joint effort between Cami Henry and Clementine Hunter, employer and employee. The figures in the boats are classic Hunter. She was known to many Melrose guests as a fabulous chef. As Valerie mentioned, she collaborated with Francois Mignon on a Melrose cookbook. She, being illiterate, dictated her recipes to him and he typed them up. I know one of our former employees made her fig cake recipe using figs from the plantation. We are lucky to have not only the African House murals at our site, but also Clementine Hunter's house, which has been moved here, and a small gallery of some of her other works. When Clementine moved to Melrose with her family circa 1900, they moved into one of the many tenant cabins that were on the larger Melrose site. These cabins are no longer standing. Most were demolished in the 1960s and 70s. The house that we have on site now is the house that she lived in from the early 1940s or early 50s until 1977. It was originally located across the road. She was able to buy a trailer with some of the money she made from her paintings and moved out of this house by 1977. When she moved, the APHN recognized the importance of preserving her house and arranged to have it brought onto the Melrose Plantation historic site. There it sat for over 30 years. In 2014, we began the work of restoring the house. An exhibit was installed throughout the 4 rooms that focuses on Clementine's art and life. The kitchen is recreated, as this is where she did most of her painting. A palette sits next to her chair, while tubes of oil paint, brushes, and paint thinner are scattered at the kitchen table. When she lived here, visitors frequently stopped by to meet her, see her art, and possibly purchase some. She installed a sign at the door that said 25 cents to look, and later doubled the price to 50 cents. She had a sly sense of humor about her fame. There's a story that some people knocked on her door and asked if she was the famous Miss Hunter. She told them they had the wrong house and sent them up the road. Another time, she was informed that President Jimmy Carter wished to honor her with an invitation to Washington, D.C. and the White House. Clementine, who had never traveled more than 100 miles from home her entire life, responded that if President Carter wanted to meet her, he could come to Melrose instead. She never went to D.C. Clementine Hunter's fame slowly grew. She began painting in the late 1930s. Her first shows were small gallery shows in Texas and Oklahoma in the mid-1940s, organized by friends. Her first big show was the New Orleans Arts and Crafts Show in 1945, which garnered her some recognition in newspapers. She was the first African American with a solo show at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches in 1955. While her work was honored with a solo show, the artist was not allowed to attend the exhibition because it was open to whites only. It was only due to the influence of some of her white friends and patrons that she was eventually allowed into the gallery to see her own paintings exhibited. Her work has been acquired and displayed in galleries and museums around the world, including the New Orleans Museum of Art, the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, the American Folk Art Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Louvre. A new exhibit of her works has recently opened at the Cabildo in New Orleans this spring, which Valerie mentioned earlier. In addition to her work being shown around the world, she received honors and recognitions from associations, universities, and governments. In 1985, Northwestern State University, the same institution that she had to sneak into to see her paintings, granted her an honorary doctorate of fine arts. She attended the ceremony and simply said thank you when accepting the degree. Clementine was only the 4th person and the first African American and the first illiterate person to be granted an honorary degree from this school. She received a telegram from President Ronald Reagan when she turned 100 years old. The Louisiana state government has declared October 1st Clementine Hunter Day. The APHN has been the owner of Melrose Plantation since 1971, when the site was sold by the Henry family to a land company who turned around and donated the small historic section while keeping the acres of farmland. The APHN has restored African House and the African House murals twice in their tenure. The first time in 1984 and the second time recently in 2016. The most recent restoration was a cooperative effort with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and a Hope Crew, Whitten and Proctor Fine Art Conservation, and the APHN. Here is a short video that shows you all the work that was done to preserve both this unique building and the unique murals it contains.
In the 1820s, built this mushroom-shaped 2-story structure on Melrose Plantation, located on Cane River in northwest Louisiana. Built to be a barn, the building came to be known as African House. The Trust recognized African House in 2015 as a national treasure and furthered a successful campaign to restore the time-worn building threatened by destabilization. In 1955, the acclaimed artist Clementine Hunter painted a series of 9 large oil-on-plywood panels telling the story of the early 20th century life on Melrose Plantation, told from the point of view of the African American and Creole workers. The addition of African House murals enhanced the value of this remarkable structure. The murals were cleaned and conserved in 1984. But great strides in art conservation have been made since their only cleaning. After more than 30 years exposed to the dust and insects of Cane River, the murals desperately needed maintenance. Fine art conservators Jill Whitten and Robert Proctor came to the rescue with the tools and expertise necessary to accomplish the state-of-the-art conservation. They took the murals down and transported them to their Houston studio for months of extensive repair and conservation. After placing the panels in a nitrogen chamber to kill insects, the WP team cleaned and restored each square centimeter of the 9 panels. While the extensive conservation work on the African House murals was underway in Houston, a Hope crew, provided by the Trust, spent weeks at Melrose restoring African House. After a celebratory evening at the W&P studio, where the who's who of Houston art scene came to see Clementine Hunter's now bright and compelling paintings, Whitten and Proctor installed the panels for exhibition in Natchitoches, Louisiana, where they were on display for a year at the Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame and Northwest Louisiana History Museum. Jill Whitten and Robert Proctor returned to Louisiana in March 2016 to take down and return the paintings to Melrose, 15 miles south of Natchitoches. Over several days, the Whitten and Proctor team installed moisture barrier in African House and carefully placed each panel back where it was originally installed in 1955. Home at last. Clementine Hunter never traveled more than 100 miles from her Cane River home, but her famous murals of plantation life not only made the trip to Houston and back, but also spent 2 years away. Today, the artist's culturally significant African House murals hang once again on the 2nd floor of African House, open for all to see and enjoy.
Okay, I know we're running short of time, but I'll just wrap up now. This year, we will be celebrating Clementine Hunter in several ways. We continue to offer guided tours that give access to her murals, and any visitor on a guided tour or a grounds tour can visit her house and see the wonderfully informative exhibit there. I know that our viewers today are watching from across the country, and I invite all of you to eventually make your way to our quiet corner of Louisiana. The African House murals are even better looking in person. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. It's such a fantastic opportunity for us to visit virtually the plantation and learn more about Clementine. So I want to I know we are running a little short on time. I would like to open us up for questions. So if anybody has questions, feel free to pop those in the Q&A box now. But I do want to start us out with the first question. And this question is for Heather. I believe when we were talking a little while ago, you had mentioned a family member who is related to Clementine, who may be offering paintings in your gift shop. And I'm wondering
Yes.
if you could talk about that.
That's something I skipped over there at the end. Yeah, we have original paintings by James Hunter, who is one of Clementine Hunter's grandsons. He was taught by her to paint in her style. And so we have canvases painted by him, as well as some snuff bottles, continuing in Clementine's tradition of painting on anything that'll take paint. And so he supplies those to our gift shop, and we sell those originals.
It's really incredible to hear that you guys are working with the family. I also am wondering if that cookbook will ever make an appearance in your gift shop.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'd have to look and see who published it. The picture that I showed in the presentation was from a donated copy that we only received a year or two ago. So I would have to look into that, but it's amazing because a lot of the recipes are named after Melrose or Cane River areas or personalities. There's one named after Quan Quan. There's one named after Isle Brevel. The one I posted was, fig cake Clementine. She named one after herself. And some of her recipes were, quite famous among the guests at Melrose. So like Valerie, I'm very curious as to, how good they taste.
Okay, so we have a couple questions rolling in here. One question in particular, if we all can kind of think back to the video of the Africa House, there was a log structure set on an angle outside of the house. Somebody is wondering what that is.
Yeah, I think I know exactly what they're talking about because that was something that caught my eye when I first came to Melrose, and we do get a lot of questions about it. It's, gosh, I'm blanking on the name for it, but it's basically set up as an alternative to a saw pit. So it's a log, it's a big log kind of on a 45-degree angle that's being held up by another log, and there are notches in the top log. And you would roll logs up on it so you could cut off the ends. And it was actually installed, I believe, or set up by the Hope crew when they were restoring African House. They were using traditional Creole techniques of building, and so they created this kind of saw structure and used it, and then left it there as kind of a memento. And we do get a lot of questions about it.
So interesting. We have a question regarding the panels upstairs. Somebody is wondering what those panels are, what she actually painted on.
Oh, they were plywood.
All right.
Yeah, plywood with oil paints.
Let's see here. Feel free to send in more questions, but I also want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I do have a lot of thank yous for you, Heather, for such a great presentation. I
apologize for going long, everybody.
I think I might just end our Q&A here. We definitely want to thank all of you, Valerie, Heather, for joining us today on this virtual road trip. As you know, tonight's tour is brought to you by the James Castle House, a program of the Boise City Department of Arts and History, the Historic Artist Homes and Studios, a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Melrose Plantation. I do want to take a moment to thank the staff at the James Castle House who run the show behind the scenes, and to all of our participants today for committing some time on a virtual presentation when it is likely very beautiful outside your walls. So your support means the world to us. Thank you so much. We will pop in the chat our contact information if we did not get to your question, or if you have more questions about today's presentation. And just real quick, before we close, for those of you anxious to start planning your own road trips, I highly recommend checking out the Historic Artist Homes and Studios Guidebook. It is available online. You can get it online at thejamescastlehouse.org and other online retailers. I'll just show you very quickly the very visual guidebook of 256 pages that takes you along the United States, grouped by US region, making it almost impossible as you plan your own road trips this summer to pass by an artist home site. We hope you'll join us next month as we visit the Roger Brown Study Collection in Chicago on July 21st. You can register for that event on the James Castle House website. Thank you all so much and be well. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.